an honor to speak, and I sincerely regret that I can't be there in person. But I found out 2 weeks ago that my vaccine only gave me about 40% protection because of some medications I was on back in February when I got them. So it's smart not to be in a group at this time. Anyway, but here we are, and it's true. I met Arnie when I was 15. It goes back to when I was a freshman at Weston High School, and came in one morning and someone yelled out, "Hey, Arnie Ginsberg mentioned Weston High School on his radio show last night." I said, "Arnie Ginsberg? Who is Arnie Ginsberg?" I couldn't believe somebody would be on the radio with an ethnic name, because everybody with them was Jim Roberts or Bob Smith, or just, lily white waspy names. So that night I tried to listen, and to get Arnie on 1600 WBOS was a challenge because the signal was very poor in the western suburbs. But I listened to the Night Train show and heard Arnie, and like everybody else, fell in love with the show, which was very entertaining. It wasn't just the music, it was Arnie. And Arnie was sort of like Beyonce. Not that he looked like Beyonce, but she once called herself Sasha Fierce, because off stage, Beyonce is the most laid back, deferential, sweet person you'd ever want to meet. She's lovely. But she gets on stage and she's got her red, fuck me heels on, and away she goes. And Arnie was like that on the air, as we all know. He was fantastic. So about a year or so after that, a friend of mine and I made a record. And we thought, well, what do we do? Let's call Arnie Ginsberg up and see if he'll play it on his show. So we did, and he said, okay. He said, why don't you bring it in tomorrow afternoon, and I'll listen to it, and if it's any good, we'll play it on the show. So we did, and it was amazing to meet him in this dirty WBOS studio on Comm Ave in Boston, right at the Cottage Farm Bridge, right at the corner, right across from Cadillac Olds. And so that night we went on the Night Train show, and it was thrilling, and everybody in school heard it, and we were big stars. And then the next day he called us up to tell us that he'd gotten a letter from Roulette Records, because we used portions of one of their songs, and they were going to claim copyright violation and blah, blah, blah for these two kids from Weston High School. So that was about it, and kept listening to Arnie all the time, and then somehow I met him one night at, this is, I was in my 20s. Of course, I was in radio, so I was always aware of him, and I loved his style because he was so much fun and so funny. Arnie was on WMEX 1510. He'd moved over. Mac Richmond hired him when Joe Smith went off the air and went to New York to be in the record business. And the morning show on WMEX was hosted by a guy named Fenway. So I remember coming down by Boston College, heading home one night, listening to Arnie, and he said, don't forget tomorrow morning to put your radio on 1510 to get your ham and eggs. Fenway's the ham and WME eggs. I almost drove into a tree. I thought that was so clever. And Arnie had this clever sense of humor that we all appreciated and we all loved. He'd find humor in anything. He really did. And he had a great way of looking at things, analyzing things. He was a great engineer. And sometime in the late 60s, I think 1968, Arnie was hired by RKO General to go to work to do the night show on WRKO, which had just changed from being an old line station to being a top 40 station, going up against WMEX and WBZ. And Arnie was hired, and Mac Richmond, of course, was furious. So Mac claimed that he had a contract with Arnie, and the contract said Arnie couldn't work for any competitor for 2 years. J.J. Jeffrey had the same contract mysteriously come up. Make a long story short, Arnie always told me he'd never signed such a contract. But it went to court, and Bill Lender, Mac Richmond's lawyer, convinced the court that it indeed was Arnie's signature on it, even though there were questions about that. So Arnie couldn't be on the air on WRKO anymore. So he went into sales, because he had relationships with all the clients and everybody. Oh, it's Arnie Ginsberg. And he became the top billing sales guy at WRKO. After that, somehow Arnie and I became friends, which I was thrilled. And he said, well, I don't need this record collection anymore. So he gave me his entire collection of 45 RPM records from 1958 to 1968, which I still have, which probably has a ton of very valuable stuff in it now because vinyl's had a comeback. Jumping through the years, I'm trying to think of other events and things that happened. I'd see Arnie at, dinners they'd have for artists or shows. And we became friends. And then around 1970, 72, I put a radio station on the air on Nantucket Island. And Nantucket has a bunch of old people, just like most of Cape Cod. And I thought, what are we going to do for programming? So we put on this format that came in by satellite called Stardust. Arnie had been very successfand with WXKS AM with the Music of Your Life format, which he put on and did extremely well for a station that wasn't on the air at night, didn't come on in the morning until 7 o'clock, and went off the air at sunset, which is 4:15 in December. But the station did great in the ratings because it had a very loyal audience in the Medford, Malden, Everett area, which had a lot of Italian people who loved that old ballad music, Perry Como and Frank Sinatra and so forth and so on. So I said, Arnie, would you listen to this Stardust format? So he did. He said, there's something wrong with it. And then he finally figured it out. And he called me up one day, I've been thinking about that, which is the way Arnie was. He'd take a problem and go in the back of his mind. He'd think about it every so, then he'd come up with a solution. And he said, they don't play enough ballads. Music of Your Life is about romantic music, not about just old music. And he nailed it. And that was the issue. What's another Arnie story? Oh, so I guess before this happened, he called me up and told me he was hired as general manager of WBCN by B. Mitchell Hastings, who was the owner of the station, which was really a strange thing to put together someone like Arnie, who was logical and practical with an engineering mind, with a bunch of, constantly stoned hippies who were, protesting everything. And culturally, it was oil and water. And that didn't work out, but it next went out that Arnie was hired to become the general manager of a little station in Medford called WHIL, which stood for Hilda, which was the name of the wife of the guy who gave the owner of the station the money to buy it. So W. Hilda was an AM station at 1430, which ended up becoming WXKS AM. And they had an FM station, and the FM station was on a 100-foot antenna in Medford. You could get it for about 8 miles. It didn't cover anything. It was at 107.9. The main thing they used it for was covering Malden, Everett, Medford basketball and football games. And they could use that for the night games because W. Hilda had to go off the air at sunset. And that was going along for a little while. And Arnie came up with this idea of changing the format to beautiful music. WJIB had become the beautiful music breakthrough FM station in Boston. Arnie secured a lease to move the FM tower from this little 100-foot stick in Medford up on top of the Prudential. And he was the first one to do such a thing and got a nice lease, long-term lease for no money, and locked it in, which later, when it came time to renew it, it went like 10 times because Arnie done such a good job saving the money for W. Hilda. And he called me up and he said that they've come up with a new name for the station. I said, oh, what is it? Well, I can't tell you, but I'll let you know next week. So he calls me up. We're announcing it tomorrow. I said, what is it? WWEL. Well. And I couldn't understand why that was good. But anyway, WWEL ended up becoming WXKS when Richie Balsbaugh and Cecil Heftel entered the picture. And as Richie Balsbaugh has said many times, he was a young guy coming in with his first job as a general manager. And he needed somebody seasoned who knew the ropes, who knew the market, who knew how these things operate to become his right-hand man, which Arnie was perfect for. And so that went on for years. And then I had meanwhile acquired or applied for and gotten a television license for a UHF TV station, which I had no idea what we were going to put on it for programming or how we were going to pay for it, but we had the license, which had some value. And one thing led to another, and it was time to build the TV station or we were going to lose the license. So I thought to myself, where am I going to get the money to do this? And you have to raise the money, blah, blah, blah. So I called up Arnie and I'm talking to Arnie. I said, well, Arnie, if you'd help me out with this, I'd really appreciate it. And I'll cut you into the ownership of it, for your contribution. He said, oh, great. Well, it started becoming more than just a little bit of advice here and there. So Arnie, after I asked him if he'd asked Richie if he could take some time off working at Pyramid Broadcasting, and if he'd come over and work with me on building this thing, which he was excited about because it was something new. And Arnie was always stimulated by new stuff. He loved the challenge, he loved the excitement and the showbiz aspect. So Richie gave him a blessing, and Arnie and I became business partners at B66. And you can see the whole story of that by watching the documentary called The Life on the V. And it's on most of the channels. I think it's on Netflix, it's on YouTube, it's on here and there. And if you haven't seen it, Arnie's great in it. He really is. And we made Arnie kind of the centerpiece. One example of what Arnie's contribution was in his practical matter, that was at a time, we raised the money to build the station. We raised $10 million, which today isn't a lot of money, but back then was. And the Boston area only had 30% cable penetration. So 70% of the people were only watching over the air. And we had the most powerful signal of any Boston television station. We were 3.5 million watts. So we had great coverage. But Arnie, who of course spent most of his time in Algonquin, Maine, where you watch cable because there's no good, strong signals except the Portland stations, which are okay. He said to me one day, he said, we've got to get on cable. He said, it's a major priority. I said, why? He said, because if you have cable and you're not on the cable, you don't exist. And I thought, that's a powerful statement. And it's true, because if you have a cable box on your TV set, you don't even know about the over-the-air station. So Arnie took it as his project to go to the cable operators and get us on cable stations. Well, just imagine how that went when Woo Woo Ginsburg calls you up. He wants to come in and visit with you. Oh, yeah, Arnie, come on in. Everybody loved Arnie. So Arnie was not only instrumental in getting us on every single cable network, all the ones, Time Warner and what became Comcast and Cox in Rhode Island, but he got us great positions on the dial. I think in the Medford, Malden, Everett, Time Warner system, we were on channel 6, perfect. In Rhode Island, we were on channel 3. I mean, great positions. And it was only because of Arnie and his charm and his recognition that happened. And of course, you go into meetings in New York when we were meeting on Wall Street with investors and, oh, Woo Woo Ginsburg. Yeah, I went to college in Boston. I loved Arnie. So that's my career path with Arnie. I could go on and on. I think all of us have our own little stories about Arnie and his wit, his intelligence, his kindness. He was one of the most wonderful people that you could ever know. everything he did was the right thing. He never knew evil or doing the wrong thing. He was always kind. He tried to do things that made sense for everyone. And I will always remember him as a vital part of my life and career as well. My final honor was being best man at Arnie's wedding to Carlos at the Wellesley Town Hall, which I have video of, which is very nice and very moving. And Arnie was so lucky to find Carlos, and Carlos was lucky to find Arnie. And Carlos' devotion to Arnie and Arnie's final years, when he really was not able to do a lot for himself, but keeping Arnie entertained, keeping him vital, taking him places and trips, and just enriched his life beyond what most people could ever hope for. So thank you, Carlos, for what you've done for Arnie. And thanks to all of us for the blessing we have for knowing Arnie.
Well, I'm Ron Della Chiesa, and I owe my radio career to Arnie Ginsberg. It started a long time ago in 1958, when I was going to Boston University. And a gentleman walked into the studio. I could see him behind glass because I was on the air, and he looked a lot like Clark Kent. He had horn-rimmed glasses, and he came around and talked to me, and he said, "How would you like to work at WBOS, an AM radio station?" I said, "I'd be thrilled." And he said, "Well, I have a part-time job opening. I'd like you to do it. I like your voice." So I came up and visited him in his studio. He was not too far from BU at the time, and climbed the stairs. And Arnie greeted me and brought me into the little tiny studio where WBOS was broadcasting, and said, "You're going to be the co-host of our ethnic radio programs." So I realized I wasn't going to have my own show, but I was going to introduce and co-host shows like the Greek Hour, the Italian Hour, the Polish Hour, and the Irish Hour. Meanwhile, Arnie was fiddling around the station, and I didn't see him go on the air at all. And that happened a bit later when he started his own show and became a radio sensation. Let me say this about Arnie. You probably don't know this, but Arnie also was the engineer that broadcast the daily, I should say, rosary from Cardinal Cushing's home in Brighton. One time I went out to visit Cardinal Cushing with a tape recorder. We were going to record him to ask about his trip to Ireland. And the first thing he said to me was, "Do you know Woo Woo Ginsberg?" And I said, "Yes, he hired me." He says, "Well, I couldn't do the rosary without Woo Woo Ginsberg. Give him my best." Little known fact about Arnie. Another thing, Arnie was an incredible engineer. Sometimes I'd be in the studio on the radio, and Arnie would be fiddling with all kinds of things underneath the console, around the console, fiddling with all kinds of wires. He was a mechanical wizard. And then he became one of the true giants of radio. You know, I've often said on the Mount Rushmore of radio, that's where Arnie should be, because what a sound, what a style he had. He fit the times to perfection. He had a voice that was so unusual. When you heard Arnie on the air, you wanted to hear him talk all night, because he had these whistles and horns and things. He made radio fun, and he had a great fun doing it. And so many young people at the time got into good R&B music because of Arnie. He played the best. I remember watching Arnie audition for his show once with different 45 records, the records that had the big hole in the middle. And there was Arnie listening to these records and just throwing them off one by one, one, 2, 3, 4, 5, until he got the right one. And he just had an ear for his audience. He knew what they wanted to hear, and he presented it in such a remarkable way. If you listen to those tapes of Arnie Ginsberg, he really knew what he's doing, and he became the icon that he was. So what a treat it is to participate in this 1950 memorial birthday celebration to the great Arnie Woo Woo Ginsberg. And Arnie, I owe it all to you. Thank you for starting my career in radio those 63 years ago, and enabling me to do something I know and I love and that I treasure. Happy birthday, Arnie Ginsberg. Everybody loves you.
Said, my name is Harry Sandler, and I'm the president of the Music Museum of New England. I've known Arnie for such a very, very, very long time. When I was a young man, long before there were cell phones and Spotify there were 45 RPM records. And Arnie was a visionary. Arnie knew we were coming out of the Frank Sinatra years. We were coming out of the Elvis Presley years. And there was a new demographic that was fast rising, the baby boomers. And the baby boomers were looking to have their world the same way their parents did. And so Arnie was wise enough to find a venue or a number of venues such as high schools, colleges, church basements were wonderful. CYOs, the Catholic Youth Organization, would put on record hops, and there would be 45s being spun all night long. The audience had never really seen anything like this because it was a young generation just coming into their own. Arnie was also wise enough to bring in bands, local bands, many local bands, musicians that were just starting out, 18 years, 19 years of age, first guitar, first set of drums. And there was an audience. There's Arnie playing these records on not only the radio, but right in front of them where they can dance, where they can mingle, where they can get to know their peer group in a rather informal setting. The audiences flipped out of those over those bands, over Arnie playing them with all of his whistles and bells. Not only did the audience flip out over the bands, but the bands flipped out over the audiences. Attention, acknowledgement. Oh my God, somebody loves me standing up here singing and doing my thing. So as time went on, the effect of the bands was transformational on the audience. That was their first taste of live music. And that audience really impacted so many of those musicians that were just starting. Now, many of those musicians, they liked the attention. Everybody likes attention. Everybody likes acknowledgement. And those musicians, they looked around and said, this is good. I'm having fun. They decide it's not something that's temporary, and they go on. Arnie was so important in starting so many careers. Arnie was so important to give so many musicians from that time frame a venue to express themselves, a forum to get to build up their own confidence and self-esteem, certainly unknown to them at that time. But as you look back, so many of those people, you had to learn how to do that somewhere. My sadness is that many of those venues don't exist any longer. I don't know that they do. High school mixers, college mixers, CYOs, even armories. Armories don't even exist. This is after World War II. So Arnie was so important, giving a large group of people a beginning. And as the president of the Music Museum of New England, I see so many of the bands that we have included, so many of the musicians, the business people, the DJs. Where did they start? They started back there in the early 1950s for this demographic. And they have gone on. I could name dozens of New England musicians and media people that have gone on to be world renowned. And it all started with Arnie. If it wasn't for Arnie, who knows? Who knows where they would be? Those record hops like that. Arnie put his stamp on it with his whistles and his bells, and he put his stamp on all of those musicians that have gone on to be world famous artists. So on behalf of all of those artists that don't play any longer, but started then, and all the ones that have gone on and started with Arnie, I want to thank Arnie for the impact that he had on all of our lives. Thanks so much, Arnie. Happy birthday, 95. Wow.
Hi, everybody. I'm Richie Balsba, and I'm very sorry I can't be in attendance today. But I wanted to pass along a short video about Arnie and about my many memories and many times with him. I'd like to start with just a quick story. I met Arnie in 1978 when I first did a pass-through of WWL as I was the new general manager and we were buying a station. And as I did the walkthrough, I went to the back of the old cinder block WWL building, and there was a door, and it opened, and there was this guy sitting in this like cinder block office. I looked, and it was Arnie Woo Woo Ginsburg. I was like freaked out. He was an idol to me. I didn't really know him, but I knew everything about him. And I was told that Arnie just had an office there. He wasn't really working for the radio station. He wasn't getting paid. So I snuck back into the office and said, Arnie, can I talk to you after we're finished with this? And he said, sure. So after we finished the tour of the building and meeting everybody, I grabbed Arnie and got together with him. I said, Arnie, would you come and work with me? And he was kind of awed by it. I don't think he knew what was going on. I said, let me tell you what we're going to do. So we had a little meeting. I told him that we're going to change the radio station from beautiful music to disco. And I had Sonny Joe White, this young program director from WWL, aboard. And I said, I'd like you to be my operations manager. I'm 29 years old. It's my first job as a general manager. I'm going to need a little bit of tutoring or tutelage. And Arnie jumped at the opportunity. And we became a really great team. Arnie, Sonny Joe White, and I. The greatest thing, well, one of the great things, Arnie found the call letters, WXKS. We named it KISS. And we had one argument at the beginning, or one disagreement. I said, we're going to call it KISS 108. And he said, you can't. He said, FM signals are all on the odd number. It's 1079. I said, yeah. What's after 1079? Nothing. I said, we're going to call it KISS 108. Well, he, in very short time, he loved that idea. And Arnie became very open-minded to a lot of crazy things. But I can really honestly say that KISS would not have been anywhere near as successful as it was, or successful at all for Arnie Ginsburg. He taught me a lot. He mentored me. He was a great friend, probably the greatest radio personality in Boston. I mean, after all, he was a general manager, an owner, an on-air personality, a program director, a sales manager. He did it all, and he imparted that knowledge to me. Arnie, I had a lot of great years with you, 1978 to 1996. And you lived a long, really successful life. I miss you, and I hope everybody there has a lot of toast to you. You're one in a million. Thanks, Ben.
So this man changed my life. Arnie Ginsburg was my cultural hero. I loved Arnie. I had never met him, but I loved him. I was a lonely kid growing up in Roslindale, Massachusetts. I was pretty much the only Jew in my neighborhood. I was probably one of the only feminists in my neighborhood. That was not a thing in the 50s, okay? I mean, yes, there were some women who thought that they might like careers and stuff. Most of us were stuck in a very conservative time where there were a lot of rules and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. And I wanted to be on the radio. And I was told I couldn't be on the radio. And I was told that you had to have a deep voice to be on the radio. Arnie didn't have a deep voice. Arnie was Arnie. He had fun. He enjoyed himself. He was entertaining. He was real. And like I said, I loved him. I loved him for the fact that he didn't change his name. It was an era where if you were on the radio, you had to be like Bob Smith, Jim Jones. That wasn't Arnie either. And my motto became, if Arnie can do it, I can do it. Because Arnie was real. Arnie was himself. Arnie was entertaining. Arnie made my childhood better. I know that sounds like hyperbole. He made your childhood better. Yes, he did. Because when I was feeling lonely, when people mocked me, when people made fun of me, I would come home, I would listen to Arnie. He played the songs I loved, but I mainly loved his personality. And he made me feel better. And I made a promise as a kid that if I could ever meet him, if I ever succeeded and I could ever meet him, I would let him know that he had really helped me get through. And I did become reasonably successful. I've written a bunch of books. I was on the radio for a number of years. But the happiest day of my life, as far as my radio career, was meeting Arnie finally in 2004. And I bowed before him and I told him how important he had been to me all my life, what a role model he had been, and how I admired him as a personality DJ, something that I still think is an important thing in radio. And I promised him that if I ever wrote a book, which I was working on, that I would put him on the cover. And I did. And it's my honor to thank Arnie even now, because I am fully certain that I would not have had my radio career if I did not have a role model like Arnie.